To the outside world, Japan is still the land of the future. It is the neon-soaked cyberpunk dreamscape of Tokyo, the high-speed efficiency of the Shinkansen, and the cultural superpower that gave us everything from Mario to Toyota. When you walk through the streets of Shibuya, you are surrounded by a society that functions with a precision that makes New York or London look like chaotic failures. The trains are on time to the second, the streets are spotless, the crime rate is virtually non-existent. From the surface, Japan looks like the ultimate success story of modern capitalism. But if you look past the neon lights and the pristine infrastructure, you find something terrifying. You find an economy that hasn't actually grown in nominal terms for 30 years. You find a central bank that has effectively nationalized the stock market in a desperate attempt to keep the illusion alive. You find a workforce that is overworked to the point of death, yet produces less value per hour than almost any other developed nation. And, most famously, you find a population that is shrinking so fast that the country is literally dissolving. The mainstream media and standard economists will tell you that Japan's problem is demographics. They will tell you that Japan is dying because women aren't having babies, and there aren't enough young people to support the old. And while that is true, it is lazy analysis. It is a symptom, not the disease. The demographic collapse is the result of a much deeper, much darker economic rot that started long before the population began to shrink. Japan isn't dying because of biology. Japan is dying because of an economic suicide pact it signed in the 1990s, a pact to protect the past at the expense of the future. It is a story of zombie companies, central bank manipulation, and a refusal to accept the pain of capitalism. And the scariest part isn't that Japan is collapsing, it's that the rest of the world, from the United States to Europe, is copying their exact playbook. To understand why Japan is doomed, we have to go back to the moment it ruled the world. In the late 1980s, Japan was not just an economic power, it was the economic predator that kept American CEOs awake at night. The narrative in the 1980s was identical to the narrative about China today. Japan was buying everything. They bought Rockefeller Center, they bought Columbia Pictures. They were buying golf courses in California for prices that made no mathematical sense. Inside Japan, the euphoria was clinically insane. At the height of the bubble in 1989, the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were estimated to be worth more than the entire real estate market of the state of California. The Nikkei stock index hit nearly 39,000. Money was so cheap and so abundant that corporations were making more money speculating on financial assets, known as Zytec, than they were making by manufacturing cars or electronics. It was the greatest misallocation of capital in human history. The Japanese believed they had rewritten the laws of economics. They called it the Japanese management style, a system where the government, banks, and corporations worked in a coordinated iron triangle to ensure perpetual growth. But bubbles, by definition, are a mathematically impossible future being priced into the present. On December 29, 1989, the Nikkei peaked, and then the music stopped. When a bubble bursts in a normal capitalist economy, it is supposed to be a forest fire. It is painful. It burns down the dead wood. Weak companies go bankrupt, assets are liquidated, prices crash to reality, and from the ashes, new, stronger growth emerges. This is the cycle of creative destruction. But Japan refused to burn. When the crash hit in the early 90s, the Japanese government and the corporate elite made a fateful decision. Nobody would be allowed to fail. The banks were sitting on trillions of yen in bad loans, loans made to developers for land that was now worthless. In a free market, those banks would have collapsed, wiping out shareholders and bondholders. But the Ministry of Finance viewed bank failures as a national humiliation. Instead, they invented the zombie company. Banks were instructed to keep lending money to insolvent companies just so those companies could pay the interest on their old loans. It was a shell game. The companies were dead, but they were kept on life support with cheap credit. This prevented mass unemployment and saved face for the political elite, but it destroyed the economy's metabolism. Because these zombie companies were kept alive, they continued to produce goods and services, often at a loss, which drove down prices. This made it impossible for new, innovative companies to enter the market. You cannot compete with a rival who doesn't need to make a profit to survive. Capital was trapped in the dying industries of the past: construction, low-end retail, old-school manufacturing, instead of flowing into the software and internet revolution that was about to take off in Silicon Valley. This is the first pillar of Japan's suicide, the refusal to liquidate the past. By saving the losers, they killed the winners. This led to the lost decade, then the second lost decade, and now we are in the third. But how do you keep a zombie economy alive for 30 years? You need money, an infinite amount of it. Enter the Bank of Japan, BOJ. Japan is the patient zero of modern monetary madness. Everything the US Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank have done since 2008, quantitative easing, QE, zero interest rates, yield curve control, Japan did first. They are the pioneers of trying to print your way to prosperity. When the bubble burst and the zombies started to rot, deflation set in. Prices started falling. In a desperate attempt to spark inflation and growth, the Bank of Japan cut interest rates to zero. It didn't work. So they went to negative interest rates. They started charging banks to hold cash. That didn't work. So they invented quantitative easing, printing new yen to buy government bonds. When that wasn't enough, the BOJ started buying things that no central bank should ever touch. They started buying corporate bonds. Then they started buying stocks. Today, the Bank of Japan is the largest owner of Japanese stocks. Let that sink in. The entity that prints the currency is also the largest shareholder in the nation's companies. This is not capitalism. It is state-sponsored feudalism masked as a market. The result of this money printing was not an economic boom, it was a distortion of reality. By keeping interest rates at zero, and now near zero, for decades, the BOJ killed the signaling mechanism of the price of money. In a healthy economy, interest rates tell you how risky an investment is. In Japan, money has no cost. This encouraged even more inefficiency. Why innovate or increase productivity when you can just borrow money for free? This creates the liquidity trap. The Japanese people, seeing the stagnation and fearing for the future, didn't spend the printed money. They hoarded it. Corporations didn't invest in new technology. They sat on cash piles or bought back their own shares. The government stepped in to fill the void, borrowing the printed money to build bridges to nowhere and pave rivers with concrete, running up the highest debt-to-GDP ratio in the industrialized world. Japan's government debt is now over 260% of GDP. To put that in perspective, the United States is panicked about hitting 120%. Japan is in a debt stratosphere that should technically result in state collapse. So why hasn't Japan collapsed yet? For a long time, the answer was because they owe the money to themselves. Unlike Argentina or Greece, which borrowed in foreign currencies, Japan borrows in yen, and 90% of the debt is held by Japanese citizens and institutions. It is a closed loop. The wife, the household saver, lends money to the husband, the government, to spend on dinner. As long as the family stays together, the bankruptcy is theoretical. But that loop is breaking. And this brings us to the modern crisis, the yen and the carry trade. Because Japan kept interest rates at zero while the rest of the world, especially the US, raised rates to fight post-COVID inflation, a massive gap opened up. Investors realized they could borrow yen for free in Tokyo, convert it to dollars, and buy US Treasury bonds yielding 5%. It was free money. This is the carry trade. Selling the yen to buy dollars crashed the value of the Japanese currency. In roughly 2 years, the yen lost a third of its value against the dollar. For an import-reliant island nation that buys its energy and food from abroad, this is a catastrophe. It imports inflation. The cost of living for the average Japanese salaryman skyrocketed. Real wages in Japan have been falling for nearly 2 years straight. The Bank of Japan is now trapped in a nightmare scenario, a zugzwang where every move loses. Option A, they raise interest rates to save the yen and stop inflation. If they do this, the interest payments on the government's massive 260% debt pile will explode, consuming the entire national budget and bankrupting the state. Furthermore, the zombie companies, addicted to free money, would instantly collapse, causing mass unemployment. Option B, they keep rates low to save the government and the zombies. If they do this, the yen continues to spiral into worthlessness, destroying the purchasing power of the people and causing a capital flight as Japanese savers finally give up and move their money abroad. They are choosing option B, with slight modifications, hoping for a miracle. They are choosing the slow death of the currency over the sudden death of the debt bubble. But the economic stagnation has a cultural cost, and this is where the demographics finally come into the picture. The low birth rate narrative is actually a story about the destruction of the Japanese social contract. Post-war Japan was built on the salaryman model. You joined a company at 22. You worked crazy hours, you showed total loyalty, and in exchange you got lifetime employment. You couldn't be fired. Your salary went up with seniority, not performance. This system worked when the population was young and the economy was growing 5% a year. But when the bubble burst and the stagnation set in, corporations stopped offering lifetime employment to the young. They created a two-tier labor market. The older generation kept their protected, high-salary jobs and benefits. The younger generation, the so-called lost generation, was forced into irregular contract work with no security, low pay, and no benefits. To today, nearly 40% of the Japanese workforce is non-regular. These people make half as much as regular employees. They cannot get mortgages. They have no career progression. Now, ask yourself, why aren't they having kids? It is not because they prefer anime or virtual girlfriends. It is because they are economically castrated. In a culture where the man is still expected to be the breadwinner, a man with a contract job and no future cannot get married. The marriage rate has plummeted in lockstep with the decline in regular employment. The young look at the future and see only decline. They see a pension system that is mathematically Ponzi, They are paying taxes to support the wealthiest generation of elderly people in history, knowing full well that the money won't be there when they get old. Japan is a gerontocracy, a rule by the old. The politicians are old. The voters are old. The corporate boards are old. This brings us to the innovation crisis. You would think Japan, the land of robots, would be the most productive country on Earth. In reality, Japan has the lowest productivity in the G7. Why? Because of the cultural refusal to modernize business practices. Walk into a Japanese office today, and you will see fax machines humming. You will see people physically stamping documents with personal seals called hanko. You will see endless meetings where decisions are made by consensus, meaning nothing bold ever happens, because one dissenting voice can kill an idea. This is the Galapagos syndrome. Japanese technology evolved in isolation. They made the best flip phones in the world, Galapagos phones, with TV tuners and payment systems years before the iPhone. But because they were so focused on the domestic market and their specific hardware obsessions, they completely missed the smartphone revolution. They missed the cloud revolution. They missed the AI revolution. Sony, Panasonic, Toshiba. These companies used to dominate consumer electronics. Today, they have been hollowed out by Apple, Samsung, and Chinese competitors. Japan is still great at making the components. The image sensors in the iPhone are Sony, the capacitors are Murata, but they lost the platform wars. They became subcontractors to the American and Korean tech giants. And the corporate culture kills productivity. In the West, if you finish your work at 3 p.m., you might go home or start a new project. In Japan, leaving before your boss is a sin, so you stay until 9 p.m., pretending to work, moving papers around. This is presenteeism. It creates a statistic where Japanese people work some of the longest hours in the world but produce very little GDP per hour worked. It creates a society that is exhausted, stressed, and uninspired. So where does this end? The terrifying reality is that Japan is running out of road. The safety valve of the last 30 years was the savings of the Japanese people. The government could run deficits because the people were saving money and putting it in banks that bought the government debt. But now the people are retiring. They are drawing down their savings. The savings rate has plummeted. Japan is now running trade deficits. This means Japan will soon have to rely on foreign investors to buy its debt. And foreign investors are not patriotic. They will demand higher interest rates to hold the debt of a shrinking, stagnating nation. If rates rise, the game is over. The endgame looks like this. The Bank of Japan will be forced to print money not just to stimulate the economy, but to directly monetize the debt to prevent default. This will lead to a loss of confidence in the yen. We could see a currency crisis in a major G7 nation. The standard of living for the Japanese people will collapse as imports become unaffordable. The country will essentially close in on itself, becoming a strange, high-tech museum of the 20th century, populated by robots and old people, while the young flee to countries where hard work actually pays off. But we shouldn't be looking at Japan with judgment. We should be looking with horror. Because if you look at the United States and Europe today, what do you see? You see soaring debt-to-GDP ratios. You see central banks that own huge chunks of the bond market. You see a refusal to let zombie companies fail. Look at the bailouts during 2008 and 2020. You see an aging population and a broken pension system. You see a younger generation locked out of housing and asset ownership, delaying marriage and kids. Japan isn't an anomaly. Japan is the future. They are just 20 years ahead of us on the timeline. They are the canary in the coal mine of late-stage capitalism. We laughed at their lost decades, but we are currently living through the first decade of our own stagnation. The story of Japan proves that you cannot fight the business cycle forever. You cannot print your way out of structural reform. You cannot save the past without destroying the future. Japan tried to build a gentle capitalism where nobody ever had to lose, and in doing so, they ensured that nobody could ever really win. The sun has been setting on the Japanese economy for 30 years. The question is no longer if it will rise again. The question is whether the rest of us will follow them into the dark. This is the tragedy of the rising sun. It wasn't murdered by competitors. It wasn't destroyed by war. It simply decided, slowly and politely, to stop moving forward. And in the brutal logic of economics, standing still is the same as dying. The Japanese economy is a cautionary tale of what happens when stability becomes the only goal. The system worked perfectly to maintain social harmony, to keep unemployment low, to keep the streets safe. But the price of that stability was vitality. The animal spirits of the economy were sedated. Consider the private equity landscape. In the US, for all its faults, private equity acts as a ruthless pruner of dead wood. It buys inefficient companies, strips them, and flips them. It's brutal, but it recycles capital. In Japan, hostile takeovers are viewed as culturally offensive. Stable shareholders, mostly other friendly corporations, hold onto stock specifically to prevent takeovers. This cross-shareholding web protects management from accountability. CEOs in Japan are rarely fired for poor performance. If a company loses money for 5 years, the CEO bows, apologizes, takes a symbolic pay cut, and the company continues to lose money for another 5 years. This lack of accountability extends to the government. The Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, has ruled Japan for almost the entire post-war period. It is effectively a one-party state masquerading as a democracy. This political stagnation mirrors the economic stagnation. There is no marketplace of ideas, just as there is no marketplace for corporate control. And what about the heralded soft power? Japan pinned its hopes on cool Japan, the export of anime, food, and culture. And while successful culturally, it is economically negligible compared to the loss of the semiconductor or appliance industries. You cannot run a G7 economy on Pokemon merchandise and tourism. Tourism, ironically, has become the new pillar of the economy, but it is a pillar of poverty. Japan is now cheap. It is the bargain destination of Asia. We are seeing a reversal of roles. Tourists from China, South Korea, and Southeast Asia now come to Japan to buy luxury goods because they are cheaper in Tokyo than in Shanghai or Seoul. Japan is becoming the theme park for the rest of rising Asia, a place to be served by polite, poor locals. It is a humiliation for a country that once viewed itself as the apex of the Asian hierarchy. The final nail in the coffin is the energy crisis. Japan has almost no natural resources. After the Fukushima disaster in 2011, they shut down their nuclear reactors. They replaced that power with imported liquid natural gas, LNG, and coal. This makes the Japanese economy hypersensitive to the exchange rate. As the yen falls, the cost of lighting up Tokyo rises. It drains the national wealth every single day. They are trapped in an energy deficit that they cannot fix without turning the nuclear plants back on, which is politically toxic. So let's summarize the trap. A debt trap, too much debt to raise rates. A currency trap, too much rate divergence to save the yen. A demographic trap, too few young people to grow the economy or pay the debt. A productivity trap, a work culture that values effort over output and old tech over new. A political trap, a leadership class that refuses to administer the painful medicine of structural reform. There is no easy way out. The only way out is a crisis. A crisis that forces the default, forces the restructuring, and forces the culture to change. But Japanese culture is built specifically to avoid conflict and crisis. They will likely choose to boil slowly in the pot rather than jump out into the fire. When we look at the charts, we see the Japanification of the world. Europe is already there. Low growth, aging population, reliance on banking stability over innovation. The United States is fighting it, fueled by immigration and the tech dynamism of Silicon Valley. But the fiscal numbers in Washington look more like Tokyo every year. The lesson of Japan is that economic laws are like gravity. You can defy them for a while with jet engines of liquidity and debt, but eventually you run out of fuel. And the higher you flew, the harder you fall. Japan didn't just stumble. It spent 30 years carefully constructing a machine that prevents recovery. It is a tragedy of good intentions. They wanted to protect their workers. They wanted to protect their industries. They wanted to protect their pride. But in economics, protectionism is often just a slow form of suffocation. Japan is still a beautiful place. The food is still amazing. The trains still run on time, but make no mistake, it is a museum. A monument to a superpower that forgot that the only constant in life and in markets is change. As the yen continues its slide and the debt clock ticks higher, the world watches. We are not watching a rival anymore. We are watching a ghost, and we are terrified, because when we look in the mirror, we are starting to see the same ghost staring back at us. The lost decades are not just Japanese history anymore. They are the world's looming future.